Humankind's new DLC and game update is finally here, and as someone from Oceania, allow me to introduce and rank and review the cultures of Oceania, with some interesting districts and upgradable ones, some very powerful ones. Let's jump in and take a look. First and foremost, starting in the ancient era, Pama Nyungan. Pama Nyungan is an aesthete culture, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. Their storied lands ability gives you +3 influence, of course, for the rest of the game on landmark parts, and +5 influence on natural wonders. They have boomerang throwers that are kind of like the Olmec unique unit in a lot of ways, and a fish trap district, and I think these guys are very strong. A quick shout out though to the custom art that seems to have come along with this for all of the default units, not just the emblematic ones. Of course, something Humankind's done before. Nice to see it carrying through, and really effectively in this update. Speaking of effectively, you'll notice that this district is incredible, especially in comparison to a standard farming district. It really doesn't compare. Of course, you do need rivers, so there is a slight caveat, right? It's +2 food, and then it's +2 food per adjacent river. So if you can grab yourself a river delta or a mouth connecting lots of different rivers, you're going to be away and laughing. It is somewhat of a caveat, of course, holds it back just a little bit. I happened to get really lucky. This was literally my first spawn, and as you can see, I've got one of the fantastic, brilliant, and new natural wonders. This one maybe not quite as useful as the rest, but of course, because I get +5 influence from them, honestly, very happy with the start. Their unique unit I was pretty happy with as well. As I mentioned in the introduction, the boomerang throwers are a ranged unit, a pathfinder, so they ignore movement penalties in forest, and interestingly for them, they also regenerate health when outside of your territory. So they're quite resourceful in that respect. They're absolutely not the strongest unit, and they won't quite have the range of a proper archer, but man, they're pretty good at what they do. And of course, as an aesthete culture, you'll be very good at gathering a lot of influence fast, allowing you to grab your built wonders like the pyramids too. Moving through to era number 2, the classical era introduces the Polynesians. The Polynesians join a fairly powerful era, maybe not the most. As an expansionist, they have quite an interesting array. Their intrepid navigators means that units receive no damage from being lost at sea, a -50% maximum movement point penalty for being lost, and a little bit of extra vision range. And that combines with their unit, which is a ship, and a fairly fast one at that, and a marae, which gives influence and faith, but it also stacks depending on how many you have in the Empire. So it starts quite weak, although I'd note you can build it, as you can see, basically anywhere, but it will scale up over time. I should note it prefers to be by itself. You'll get a negative stability addition if you stack it next to districts. So try and place it nice and far away, which is where you'll be sailing to with the Whaolua, this ship, in combination with your ability to not necessarily ignore, but at least reduce some of these penalties from being lost at sea. You will be in a brilliant position to get out and explore the seas. And of course, the oceans are a big feature more broadly, with naval battles and units and everything being buffed. Moving through into the next era, I think we should. It's time for Rapa Nui in the medieval era. They're an industrial culture, the first one, of course, introduced. Generally, the DLCs try and introduce one of each time. They have the Maori tangata, a unit that is pretty cheap to get in comparison to some others in the medieval era anyway, and a little bit weaker perhaps than most, though it does specialize a little bit. More on that in a moment. The Moai is potentially the more interesting part, because it's an upgradable district, providing faith and food, and then sort of stepping up both of those and providing more. If you get your build right, of course, you can stack other things, like science, on your religious districts, for example, like I've done here. You can see that this tile is a wampa of a district, and by upgrading it and sacrificing some poor populations to quickly skip through, you can see how it scales up through each build. Of course, you do kind of have to build it 3 times, so there is quite a bit of an extra cost here. I love the flavor and theming element to it, though. I think it looks fantastic. Speaking of flavor and theming, say that 5 times fast. Of course, and sort of a callback back to something I mentioned earlier in the video, we again see even the default units kind of taking a little bit of a cultural theme here. Most of them, anyway. Moving through on to the battlefield, which is of course a big part of this update. We've already looked at, or will look at, a militarist culture, expansionist too, and the Maori tangata is very good at what it does best, which is smashing through enemy walls, basically. Fighting units on the other side of walls. You saw it just happen there. They're very good at doing just that, and then perhaps kind of average everywhere else, but with their low resource cost, I think they're a very powerful, aggressive unit. Speaking of powerful and aggressive, let's look at the early modern era, where Maori are introduced in the DLC, and of course the Caribbean pirates were also introduced for free. We'll mainly focus on Maori in this video. I've already done a separate one on the Caribbean pirates. Their pa is both a defensive building and a food supplier, and their wakatoa is essentially just an upgrade to how your troops, not your ships, move around. I wouldn't sleep on it though. It's actually very strong. Though important to note, you won't get a boat to fight with. Unlike the Caribbean pirates, who have 2 units, their trait mainly focuses on army poaching and plundering of those enemy resources, and so it's a little bit sort of situational. And they deliver 2 units, buccaneers and a sloop. Providing that you have gunpowder, of course, you will need access to it. You get a very powerful ship. Although, of course, because they both require that, it might be a little bit later in the piece. Alternatively, you could choose the Maori, who sort of flip that in reverse, instead providing a district and a way to move your existing units around the seas. 2 very different military options. The Maori, of course, also, as you can see, gives stability and it's a little bit glitchy, but basically it's triggering based on ongoing wars. Speaking of which, you will be moving across the seas very well, which will help get your land-based units over, maybe to explore the New World, as I'm doing here, or maybe to fight people. But even if you're just using it to explore the New World, you'll find that you can just completely run away with it, because you get it straight away, because there is no resource requirement except for the tech, of course, to unlock it. You'll find that you can just send your existing units, which, if you're playing the DLC like I have been, you've probably got a few land-based units already, out over onto the oceans, and you will find lots of value in ocean as well as coastal tiles. More on that soon. Let's move through to the next era now, and here we can see in the industrial era the Hawaiians take over. And in this case, they are an agrarian one. And I'm not quite convinced on my overall sort of ratings and rankings for the Hawaiians just yet. Their core warriors are very strong and come on the back of the Cape of Feathers, which gives you +5 influence per worker for the rest of the game. Now that can be pretty strong. You could maybe be looking at around 40 or 50 influence per city, looking at around 200 a turn. Very good. Their district, again, leaning into the coastal water thing, gives +15 food per adjacent ocean as well. So maybe my introduction didn't quite do them justice. Let's jump in and take a look at what they actually do, and then of course we'll make up our minds at the end of this video, where I'll break them down in a sort of early tier list structure. This tile blew me away. It is fantastic. It looks fantastic too, so extra points for the aesthetics, but by and large, this puppy is powerful. Of course, it really wants to rely on coastal water, or ocean water, I should say, but there are lots of synergetic benefits in this DLC and its cultures between the oceans and the coastal tiles. In this case, this district really does look great. A little bit glitchy maybe, as I expend some population to force this one out. They might have got a little bit overboard with the land tile that it was connecting to next door, but nonetheless, that's just probably a function of the beta. I'd also like to give a quick shout out to something I won't be focusing on in this video, but there are, of course, lots of new wonders. Cultural wonders, natural wonders, helping to build this world. In this case, a lot of science from osmosis events, which I thought was a particularly unique experience. And last but definitely not least, you can hear it in my voice, in the contemporary era, right next door to our Australian brothers and sisters, we have the New Zealanders, and they are very good at science. +20 science on coastal water, again a powerful benefit. And in this case, they're unique because they don't have a military unit. No, us Kiwis here in the mighty land of the Long White Cloud, Aotearoa, New Zealand, have a sailing club and a polar base. The polar base, of course, leaning into that Scott-based theme, and then the sailing club, maybe slightly more luxurious. Man alive, is it a powerful district. You can get a lot of science from this thing. I didn't really even fully build my faith and my civics towards science, though I did lean in a little bit to 1 or 2 coastal bonuses, as you can see, of course, when I hover over the district. The polar base, of course, requires a little bit more. It leans into sterile terrain, so if I had the one to the left of these, it would be a very powerful district. But nonetheless, it's pretty decent. And when you combine it with the exceptionally good, especially in this DLC build, Sailing Club, what you end up with are two very powerful districts that of course don't have any requirements. By that I mean tech requirements. Look at this one, 227, sheesh! No, tech requirements, you can just build them straight away, and I think that makes them outstanding. Let's jump in and review them in the context of their eras and their overall power, starting of course in the ancient era with Pama Nyungan. I think that Pama Nyungan were a pretty interesting one. Generally, their trait reliance on natural wonders maybe not quite as good, but their overall power level I think is probably better than the Olmecs. Given their fish traps rely on rivers, it's a slight detraction, but they're very good. The boomerang throwers are a pretty good unit too. I'm sort of debating between a B and an A tier. I'm going to give Pama Nyungan an A ranking. And again, just as another reminder, this is pretty early days. Rough rankings. I give it a margin of error of one ranking up or down. And of course, I welcome your feedback in the comments below. Moving through though to the classical era, we have the Polynesians. The Polynesians were one that initially I wasn't quite so sure on. I feel that perhaps their reliance through the Marae on influence and faith is perhaps not quite as good as some other yields. They're an expansionist culture, maybe also not quite as good. Their ship, and of course their intrepid navigator's ability, will allow you to get across the world faster than everyone else. So you might get some extra fame out of that. There's benefits to be decided on. I think for me, they're a B tier culture. There is a way absolutely to power up these districts, and the fact that you can place them at anywhere is great. I just don't think they quite do enough to really separate themselves out, though their influence generation is brilliant, and they do allow you to build up a faith game, which if you're exclusively trying to play these DLC cultures in particular would be great, but considering all other options, I think a B tier is about right. In the medieval era, we had Rapa Nui. Rapa Nui had the Moai upgradable district and the Maori tangata, a fairly cheap to build and very good at what it does, smashing through enemy cities unit. And then, of course, Makamake's Eye to give a little bit of industry to coastal water. Again here, I think with Rapa Nui, we see a very strong culture, not likely to be below average. Being an industrialist is great, right? Great ability. Inside of the medieval era, there's some competition, but it's sort of fairly well balanced across it. And I think that Rapa Nui reflects that. The upgradable district could give you something to do. The somewhat recent buffs to religious districts also make it a bit better. Food, faith, overall fairly cheap stuff, bonuses across the board. I think that Rapa Nui deserve a just a B grade ranking. It's very close. In the early modern era, of course, we had Maori, who do get a little bit of extra combat strength, some reduced unit upkeep, and extra stability, if I didn't make it clear enough, on their cities, per percent of ongoing war is how it's registered at the moment. I'm assuming it's per number of ongoing wars. As a militarist culture, that's great for earning your stars. Their waka upgrade is brilliantly synergetic, though not immediately overwhelmingly obvious that it's powerful. It is, because it lets you bring your land units across. And then their Pa district, of course, generally more defensive than offensive, but very powerful in both if you can get it that way, and provides a little bit of food as well to help you keep growing. I think as far as militarist cultures go, Maori are one of the most straightforward ones. They do what they're designed to do very well, but they're not especially universal outside of it. Although, should give some credit to the fact that the waka will allow you to basically get the new world. It's yours. I think overall the Maori present a fairly strong culture, and one of the best militarist cultures. For me though, they probably only deserve the ranking of an A, not quite really reaching strong enough to get to the S tier, largely because of their sort of slightly lack of universality in their design. And of course, we saw the Caribbean pirates, who uniquely only provided unique units, not any emblematic districts. With the Buccaneer and Sloop both requiring gunpowder and having slightly higher technology costs, you'll probably find that you will get these, but if you're keeping up or playing on a harder difficulty, you might get them just a bit late. The other thing to consider is their trait, which leans into the new poaching of resources mechanic, providing plus 2% across the firm's resources, as well as some combat strength on outlaws and health regeneration for units if they're poaching. They are all about poaching, very focused on poaching. Their units lean into it well, but I can't quite really give them the same ranking as the Maori because poaching is just just that step more niche than, say, going to war to get military stars, right? It's that next step removed, and I think that the delays in getting these units online kind of make them not redundant, but certainly introduce them into a very crowded space. It's for that reason that I give the Caribbean Pirates a C grade, almost a D, but I give them a C grade. And next, moving on to the Hawaiians, which are now correctly placed. Sorry if you were like ripping your head off and throwing it into outer space, the comment section below. We move to the Hawaiians in the industrial era. They give you a fairly significant buff to your influence for the rest of the game through +5 influence on your workers. They're an agrarian culture though, which is interesting, because of course they'll be more focused around food than workers or influence. They're a unique district, providing some food per adjacent coastal water, but a massive amount per adjacent ocean at +15 makes them exceptional if you can get those deep ocean tiles, which have often not been rewarded anywhere near as much as coastal ones. So not only is this an incredibly strong effect in terms of food, but also quite a unique one. Their unique unit should be fairly easy for you to get online, a gunner that doesn't require gunpowder but does require line formation, not too difficult to unlock. They're also implaceable, giving bonus combat strength against damaged targets. I think when you combine all of that together, you actually end up with a culture that at first I thought was very weak because of its scattered abilities, but actually I think it's very strong and synergetic with the DLC. For me, it has actually almost ended up being the strongest culture. For me, I think it's somewhere between the S and A groupings. I'm going to give it a low or maybe a high A tier. And last but not least, New Zealand. Trait Call of the Ocean +20 science on coastal water. So we've got some food from our oceans, but man alive, do we have a lot of rewards in humankind through faith, civic, infrastructure, and now this to get science or whatever on coastal waters. They of course also have the sailing club, which leans into that, and then the polar base, which does require sterile terrain to really make the most of itself. You've got loads of benefits to influence here across the board in the districts per researchers. And overall, they are a scientist culture. So there's kind of a blending here between influence and science. Influence perhaps less useful as the game moves on, unless you've gone quite influence heavy or maybe wonders heavy, in which case you'll still be providing value. The science though is huge, and usually I find a game-winning condition. With that huge amount of science on coastal tiles, granted in a fairly competitive space, I think that New Zealand is rightly deserving of either an S or an A tier. I wanted to give it an S, but I'm going to correct my own biases potentially and also place New Zealand at the A tier ranking. And that broadly concludes how I consider these wonderful new cultures to be balanced and factored into the meta in humankind. Thank you for joining me, everybody, and a huge shout out to the humankind fans out there. Please leave a like on your way out. I'll see you next time.